There is something unusual about the way an empath meets the world, and it often goes unnoticed, even by the empath themselves. Most people assume that perception begins with thought, that we first interpret and then feel. But for the empath, the sequence is reversed. They feel first, and that feeling is not vague or abstract. It is immediate, physical, and often overwhelming. Before a word is spoken, before a situation is logically understood, something in them has already registered what is happening. It can be a subtle tension in a room, a shift in someone's tone, an unspoken discomfort that others either ignore or simply don't perceive. The empath doesn't analyze it in that moment, they experience it. Their body responds before their mind has time to organize the experience into something coherent. This is why so many empaths grow up feeling confused by their own reactions. They may find themselves anxious in environments that seem normal to others. They may feel drained after interactions that appear harmless on the surface. And when they try to explain this, they often struggle, not because the experience isn't real, but because it exists beneath the level of conscious thought. It is pre-verbal, intuitive, and deeply embodied. From a psychological perspective, this makes sense. The empath's nervous system is highly attuned. It has learned, often early in life, to scan for emotional cues as a way of maintaining safety and connection. In environments where emotions were unpredictable, or where attunement to others was necessary for belonging, this sensitivity becomes heightened. The child learns to read not just what is being said, but what is being felt beneath the surface. And over time, this becomes automatic. So when we say an empath feels before they think, we are really describing a nervous system that has been trained to prioritize emotional information above all else. It is not a flaw, it is an adaptation. But like all adaptations, it comes with a cost. Because when feeling precedes thinking, there is often no immediate filter. The empath doesn't just notice emotion, they absorb it. And without awareness, this absorption can create a kind of internal overload. They may struggle to distinguish between what belongs to them and what originates outside of them. This is where the confusion begins. An empath might enter a conversation feeling calm, only to leave feeling unsettled, without fully understanding why. Their mind tries to catch up, to make sense of the shift, but the explanation often feels incomplete. And so they turn inward, questioning themselves. Why did I react this way? What's wrong with me? But the question itself is misdirected. Because the issue is not that something is wrong, it's that something is happening faster than they have learned to process. Their emotional awareness is operating at a level that has not yet been fully integrated into conscious understanding. And this gap between feeling and knowing can be disorienting. It can lead to self-doubt, to overthinking, to a tendency to mistrust one's own internal signals. But when the empath begins to understand this pattern, something important shifts. They start to recognize that their initial feeling is not random, it is information. Not always accurate in its interpretation, but meaningful in its origin. So instead of dismissing or becoming overwhelmed by what they feel, they begin to pause, to create space between the sensation and the story they attach to it. They learn to ask, what am I actually picking up here? Rather than immediately reacting or internalizing. And in that pause, the relationship to their sensitivity begins to change. What once felt chaotic starts to become coherent. What once felt like a burden begins to reveal itself as a form of perception that, when grounded, can be deeply insightful. Because to feel before you think is not, in itself, a weakness. It becomes a weakness only when it is unconscious, when the empath is unaware of how their system is operating. But when that awareness develops, the same sensitivity that once overwhelmed them can begin to guide them. It becomes less about reacting to every emotional signal and more about understanding which signals matter and why. And that is where the transformation begins, because the moment an empath stops questioning the validity of their experience and starts becoming curious about it, they move from confusion into clarity. And once you learn to trust what you feel, without being controlled by it, you begin to access a level of awareness that most people spend their lives trying to reach. As this awareness deepens, the empath begins to notice something even more disorienting, something that challenges their sense of identity at a very fundamental level. It's not just that they feel deeply. It's that they often feel things that don't seem to belong to them at all. They may wake up in a relatively calm state, only to find themselves hours later carrying a heaviness they cannot explain. They might be in a conversation where nothing overtly distressing is being said, yet internally, they feel tension, sadness, or unease building. And when they try to trace it back, when they ask, "Where is this coming from?" there is no clear personal origin. This is one of the most confusing aspects of the empathic experience, the absorption of emotional states that originate outside the self. And without awareness, this can become deeply destabilizing, because the mind is wired to make sense of what we feel. So when an emotion arises, we instinctively search for a narrative to explain it. If no external source is recognized, the empath often turns inward. They assume the feeling must be theirs. They begin to question their own stability, their own emotional consistency, even their own identity. But what if the feeling was never theirs to begin with? From a psychological standpoint, this phenomenon can be understood as a heightened sensitivity to emotional cues, combined with a lack of clear internal boundaries. The empath doesn't just perceive what others are feeling, they internalize it. Their nervous system mirrors the emotional state of those around them, sometimes so seamlessly that the distinction disappears. This is not a conscious process. It happens beneath awareness, in the same way that we might unconsciously mirror someone's posture or tone of voice. But for the empath, the mirroring goes deeper. It becomes emotional, somatic, immersive. And over time, this creates a pattern. They begin to carry what others are unwilling or unable to process. They hold space, not just metaphorically, but internally. They absorb tension to maintain harmony. They take on sadness to preserve connection. And because this often happens without conscious recognition, it can feel like an inherent part of who they are, rather than a dynamic they are participating in. This is where the burden begins to accumulate. Because when you are constantly holding what is not yours, your internal world becomes crowded. There is less clarity, less grounding, less sense of what actually belongs to you. And this can lead to emotional exhaustion, confusion, and a subtle but persistent loss of self. The empath may begin to feel like they are always too much or too sensitive, when in reality, they are carrying far more than their own emotional experience. But something shifts when awareness enters the picture. When the empath begins to question not just what they feel, but where it comes from, a new level of clarity becomes possible. They start to notice patterns. Certain environments leave them drained. Certain people trigger emotional states that don't align with their baseline. Certain interactions create a sense of heaviness that lingers long after the moment has passed. And instead of immediately internalizing those experiences, they begin to observe them. They might pause and ask, "Was I feeling this before I entered this space? Did this emotion arise suddenly? Or does it have a clear connection to my own experience? Am I reacting, or am I absorbing?" These questions are not about creating distance from others. They are about creating clarity within the self. Because the goal is not to stop feeling. The goal is to differentiate, to recognize that empathy does not require ownership, that understanding someone's emotional state does not mean carrying it, that compassion can exist without internalizing another person's pain. This is where boundaries begin, not as walls, but as awareness. The empath starts to develop a sense of internal separation, not in a way that disconnects them, but in a way that protects their clarity. They can still feel, still understand, still connect, but without losing their center in the process. And that changes everything, because once you realize that not everything you feel belongs to you, you begin to reclaim space within yourself. You begin to let go of what was never yours to carry. You begin to return to your own emotional baseline, rather than constantly adjusting to the states of others. And in that return, there is relief. There is grounding. There is a quiet sense of coming back to yourself. Because the truth is, empathy was never meant to be a burden. It becomes one only when it is unconscious, when the empath cannot distinguish between connection and absorption. But the moment that distinction becomes clear, the entire experience begins to transform. Because you are no longer at the mercy of what you feel, you are in relationship with it. And once you stop carrying what was never yours, you create the space to finally understand what truly is. As the empath begins to distinguish between what they feel and what actually belongs to them, another pattern becomes impossible to ignore. There is a growing need, not for more connection, but for distance. Not as rejection, but as restoration. This is where many empaths begin to confuse themselves. Because on one hand, they genuinely value depth, intimacy, and meaningful relationships. They are not indifferent people. They are not detached by nature. In fact, they often long for connection more than most. But on the other hand, they find themselves withdrawing, canceling plans, needing time alone, stepping back from environments that once felt manageable. And this creates an internal tension. Why do I want connection, but also feel the need to escape it? Why do I feel drained by the very thing I care about? The answer lies not in contradiction, but in regulation. For the empath, connection is not a neutral experience. It is immersive. It engages the nervous system at a much deeper level. Every interaction carries emotional data, subtle cues, unspoken dynamics, and over time, this accumulation becomes overwhelming if it is not processed. So the withdrawal is not avoidance. It is recovery. It is the nervous system's way of saying, there is too much here. I need space to come back into balance. But because many empaths have been conditioned to prioritize others, to be available, responsive, present, they often override this need. They push through the exhaustion. They stay engaged longer than they should. And in doing so, they move further away from themselves, until eventually, something gives. They feel irritable without understanding why. They lose clarity. They become emotionally reactive in ways that don't feel aligned. And then, often with a sense of guilt, they pull away completely, sometimes more abruptly than they intended. This cycle, over-engagement followed by withdrawal, is not a flaw in character. It is a lack of rhythm. Because what the empath is learning, often without guidance, is that their system requires a different kind of pacing. They are not designed for constant exposure to emotional intensity. They need intervals. They need space not just physically, but internally, to process, to release, to return to their own baseline. And when they begin to honor this, something shifts. Solitude stops feeling like loneliness and starts feeling like clarity. In those quiet moments, without the influence of others' emotions, they begin to reconnect with themselves. They can finally ask, what am I actually feeling? And hear an answer that is not distorted by external input. Their thoughts become more coherent. Their body softens. Their internal world becomes less crowded. This is not isolation. It is integration. It is where everything they have absorbed, consciously or unconsciously, begins to settle. Where what is theirs separates from what is not. Where their identity, which may have been shaped by constant attunement to others, begins to reassemble around their own experience. And this process is essential, because without it, the empath remains externally oriented, always responding, always adjusting, always absorbing. But with it, they begin to develop an internal anchor, a place within themselves that is not defined by who they are with, or what they are feeling in response to others, but by a deeper sense of self-awareness. This changes how they show up in the world. They become more intentional with their energy. They start to recognize when they are reaching their limit, not after they've already exceeded it. They give themselves permission to step back without over-explaining, and perhaps most importantly, They begin to understand that taking space is not a rejection of others, it is a commitment to themselves. And from that commitment, their relationships begin to change. Because when an empath returns to connection from a regulated, grounded state, they are no longer depleted. They are present. They are clear. They are able to engage without losing themselves in the process. So the need for isolation is not something to fix. It is something to respect. Because it is in those moments of stepping away that the empath actually becomes more whole, more stable, more capable of true connection. And once they stop seeing solitude as something to feel guilty about and start recognizing it as something necessary, they begin to move through the world differently. Not constantly available, not endlessly accommodating, but balanced. Because the truth is, you cannot remain connected to others if you are disconnected from yourself. And sometimes, the most important step an empath can take is not toward people, but back toward their own center. As the empath begins to spend more time in that internal space, separating what is theirs from what is not, learning the rhythm between connection and solitude, another pattern becomes increasingly visible. It shows up in the quiet moments after interaction, when the external world has gone still but the internal world remains active. A conversation that seemed simple on the surface doesn't end when it's over. It continues. The empath replays it. Not once but repeatedly. They revisit specific words, shifts in tone, pauses that may have lasted only a second. They examine expressions, timing, subtle changes in energy. And as they do this, they begin to construct layers of meaning, sometimes accurate, sometimes speculative, but always driven by a deep sensitivity to what lies beneath the obvious. To someone observing from the outside, this can look like overthinking. It can be dismissed as anxiety, insecurity, or unnecessary complexity. But for the empath, it is something else entirely. It is an attempt to reconcile what was felt with what was seen. Because during the interaction, they didn't just hear words, they registered incongruence. They noticed when something didn't quite align, when a smile didn't reach the eyes, when a response felt slightly delayed or emotionally disconnected. And while they may not have addressed it in the moment, their system marked it. So later, when they are alone, the mind tries to catch up with the body's perception. It begins asking questions. Did I miss something? Was there tension I didn't acknowledge? Did I say something that shifted the energy? And beneath these questions is a deeper drive, not just to understand others, but to maintain relational harmony. Because for the empath, disconnection is rarely neutral. It carries weight. It can feel like a subtle threat, even when nothing explicit has occurred. So the analysis continues. But here's where the complexity deepens. This process is not purely cognitive. It is emotionally charged. The empath is not just thinking about the interaction, they are feeling it. Each time they revisit the moment, the emotional imprint is reactivated. And without awareness, this can create a loop where feeling and thinking reinforce each other, amplifying the experience beyond its original intensity. This is where overanalysis becomes exhausting. Not because the empath is wrong to notice nuance, but because they have not yet learned when to stop engaging with it. Their sensitivity picks up more than most, but without boundaries around their attention, they can become entangled in interpretations that go far beyond what is useful or grounded. And often, there is an underlying assumption driving this pattern, that if they can just understand everything, every nuance, every shift, they can prevent disconnection, avoid misunderstanding, maintain stability. But that assumption carries a hidden cost. It places responsibility for relational clarity entirely on the empath. It suggests that if something feels off, it must be their role to figure it out, to adjust, to resolve it internally, even when the dynamic involves another person's unspoken reality. And this is where a shift becomes necessary. Because not everything that is felt needs to be analyzed indefinitely. Not every subtle cue needs to be decoded, and not every interaction can be fully understood from one side alone. As the empath matures, they begin to recognize this. They start to see that their perception is valuable, but it is not infallible. That their sensitivity can guide them, but it can also lead them into unnecessary complexity if it is not grounded. And that clarity does not always come from deeper analysis. It often comes from stepping back. So instead of replaying endlessly, they begin to pause. They might still notice what felt off, but they no longer feel compelled to resolve it immediately. They allow for uncertainty. They accept that some dynamics will remain unclear, and that not all emotional signals require interpretation. This is not disengagement. It is discernment. They begin to ask a different kind of question. Is this worth my energy? And if the answer is no, they let it go, not because it doesn't matter, but because they understand that their attention is finite, and where they place it shapes their internal state. This changes the relationship to their own mind. What once felt like a constant analysis becomes more selective. What once consumed their energy becomes something they can observe without being pulled into. And over time, this creates a sense of mental spaciousness, a relief from the pressure to understand everything. Because the truth is, not all clarity comes from thinking. Sometimes, it comes from trusting that what was felt is enough, and that you don't need to dissect every moment to validate your experience. And once the empath learns to step out of that loop, they reclaim not just their energy, but their peace. Because real awareness is not found in endless analysis. It is found in knowing when to stop. As the empath begins to step out of that constant loop of analysis, learning when to engage and when to let go, another challenge emerges, one that is far more uncomfortable, because it touches something deeply rooted in their identity. It's not about what they feel or how they think anymore. It's about what they allow. And this is where the question of boundaries becomes unavoidable. Because for most empaths, the difficulty is not in recognizing when something is too much. They often feel that very clearly. The difficulty is in acting on that recognition without being overwhelmed by guilt. There is a moment, quiet but intense, when they know they need to say no, to step back, to limit their availability. And yet, something in them resists. Not because they don't understand the need, but because of what that action seems to represent. To set a boundary, for the empath, can feel like withdrawing care. It can feel like disappointing someone, creating distance, even causing harm. And because they are so attuned to how others feel, they don't just anticipate that reaction, they feel it in advance. They imagine the other person's disappointment, confusion, or hurt, and that imagined emotional response becomes almost as real as if it were already happening. So they hesitate. They override their own limits. They say yes when they mean no. They remain present when they are already depleted. And in doing so, they maintain the connection, but at the expense of themselves. This pattern is not simply about kindness. It is about conditioning. Many empaths learned early on that their value was connected to how well they could meet the needs of others. That being accommodating ensured acceptance. That being selfless created stability. And over time, this becomes internalized, not as a strategy, but as an identity. I am the one who understands. I am the one who is there. I am the one who doesn't make things difficult. But what often goes unexamined is the cost of maintaining that identity. Because every time the empath ignores their own boundary, they reinforce a subtle message to themselves: my needs are secondary. And over time, this creates an internal imbalance. They become highly responsive to others, but increasingly disconnected from their own limits. Until eventually, that disconnection becomes unsustainable. They feel resentment, even if they don't express it. They feel exhaustion that rest alone cannot fix. They feel a quiet frustration, not just with others, but with themselves, for continuing to participate in dynamics that they know are draining. And this is where something begins to shift. Not suddenly, not without discomfort, but gradually. The empath starts to see that guilt is not always a signal of wrongdoing. Sometimes, It is simply the emotional residue of stepping outside a familiar role. They begin to understand that saying no does not mean they are being unkind. It means they are being honest. And honesty, especially in relationships that have been built on overgiving, can feel disruptive. Because when the empath starts to set boundaries, the dynamic changes. People who were used to their availability may not immediately understand the shift. They may question it, push against it, or interpret it through their own expectations. And this is where the empath faces a deeper challenge. Can they hold their boundary, even when it creates discomfort, not just in others, but within themselves? Because setting a boundary is not a one-time act. It is a process of staying aligned with it, even when it feels unfamiliar. Even when the old impulse to accommodate resurfaces. Even when the desire to avoid tension tempts them to step back into old patterns. But each time they choose to honor their limit, something strengthens. They begin to trust themselves. They begin to feel a different kind of stability, not the fragile stability that comes from keeping everyone else comfortable, but the deeper stability that comes from being in integrity with their own experience. And from that place, something unexpected happens. Their care becomes clearer, more intentional, less entangled in obligation. They are still compassionate, still understanding, but no longer at the cost of their own well-being. Their presence becomes more sustainable because it is no longer built on self-sacrifice. This is where boundaries stop being barriers and start becoming expressions of self-respect. And the guilt that once felt so heavy begins to lose its hold, not because they stop caring about others, but because they start caring about themselves in the same way. Because the truth is, a boundary is not a rejection of connection. It is a commitment to making that connection honest. And once an empath learns to tolerate the discomfort of being true to themselves, they step into a form of strength that no longer depends on being everything for everyone. And as all of these shifts begin to settle, the awareness of what they feel, the ability to distinguish what is theirs, the rhythm between connection and solitude, the release from constant analysis, and the courage to set boundaries, something quietly transformative takes place within the empath. It doesn't arrive as a dramatic breakthrough. There is no single moment where everything suddenly changes. Instead, it emerges gradually, almost imperceptibly, in the way they carry themselves, in the way they respond, in the way they no longer respond. They become still, not indifferent, not disconnected, but steady. Where there was once urgency, there is now patience. Where there was once a need to react, to fix, to engage immediately, there is now space. And in that space, a different kind of intelligence begins to operate, one that is not driven by emotional overwhelm, but guided by clarity. This is where the empath becomes quietly powerful. Because earlier, their sensitivity was often entangled with reactivity. They felt everything, but they didn't always have the capacity to hold what they felt without being moved by it. Their actions were sometimes shaped by the intensity of the moment, by the pull of others' emotions, by the need to maintain harmony or avoid disconnection. But now that dynamic begins to dissolve. They still feel deeply, but they are no longer controlled by what they feel. They can sit in the presence of someone else's distress without absorbing it. They can recognize emotional manipulation without being pulled into it. They can sense when something is off without needing to immediately correct or resolve it. And perhaps most importantly, they no longer feel responsible for everything they perceive. This is a profound shift. Because for much of their life, awareness came with a kind of burden. If they could see it, feel it, understand it, then surely they must do something about it. They must intervene, support, adjust, carry. But now they begin to understand that awareness does not equal obligation. They can witness without rescuing. They can care without overextending. They can be present without losing themselves. And this changes the very nature of their presence. There is a calmness that wasn't there before, a grounded quality that others can feel, even if they can't explain it. It's not loud. It doesn't demand attention. But it holds a kind of quiet authority that comes from being internally aligned. People may respond to this in different ways. Some will feel safe in it. They will sense the steadiness, the lack of pressure, the absence of emotional entanglement. They will find it easier to be authentic around someone who is no longer trying to manage the interaction. Others, however, may feel unsettled because they are used to a different version of the empath, the one who adjusted, who accommodated, who filled in the emotional gaps. And now, that version is no longer present. The empath is still there, but they are no longer participating in the same way. They are not chasing. They are not convincing. They are not overgiving. They are simply there. And that, just being, carries a kind of power that is often misunderstood. It is not control. It is not dominance. It is self-possession. The empath is no longer fragmented by competing needs or external pressures. They are not pulled in multiple directions by the emotions around them. They are centered. And from that center, their actions become more intentional, their words more measured, their presence more impactful. This is what it means to become integrated. Not perfect, not unaffected, but whole enough to remain grounded in the midst of complexity. To feel deeply without becoming overwhelmed. To connect without dissolving. To step back without collapsing into guilt or self-doubt. And in that integration, something becomes clear. The empath was never too much. They were never too sensitive. They were simply operating without the awareness and structure needed to support the depth of what they feel. Now, that structure is forming, and with it comes a new way of being, one that is not defined by reactivity, but by choice. Not by overextension, but by alignment. Not by the need to be everything for everyone, but by the willingness to be fully present as themselves. This is the quiet transformation that others may not immediately understand, but they will feel it. Because when someone is no longer seeking to be validated, no longer trying to manage perception, no longer driven by unconscious patterns, their presence becomes unmistakably real. And that kind of presence has an impact. It invites honesty. It reveals dynamics. It changes the space without needing to control it. And for the empath, this is not something they need to perform. It is simply who they have become. Because in the end, the most powerful shift is not in how the empath relates to others. It is in how they relate to themselves. And once that relationship is grounded in awareness, in respect, in truth, there is a kind of strength that no longer needs to prove itself. Because real power is not in how much you feel or how much you give. It is in your ability to remain fully yourself, no matter what you are surrounded by.